to Service Georgina on Rogers TV. I'm Mayor Margaret Quirk. Our goal is to bring you information to help you understand more about the many services and departments of the town of Georgina. Today's show will focus on the town's 2021 budget, and we'll also talk about the role of the CAO and the town's business continuity during the pandemic. Joining me today is Dave Redden, Georgina's Chief Administrative Officer, or the CAO, and Rob Weeder, Director of Corporate Services and our Treasurer. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Welcome, Madam Mayor.
It's a little different. We're doing all of our meetings by Zoom, but it's good to have the two of you. We're not in the same room, but we're going to talk about the 2021 budget. So we'll start with that. Rob, maybe give us just some of the basics. A municipal budget is made up of two parts, operating and capital. And maybe you can tell us what the difference is.
Yeah, so the biggest difference is the operating budget is really the day-to-day services that the municipality is providing. So it's the garbage pickup, it's the snow plowing, it's those types of services. Whereas when we look at the other side, the capital budget, it's really the infrastructure. So it might be the replacement of a road rather than just the plowing of a road. It could be the purchase of a fire truck or water infrastructure. So those are really the biggest differences.
So how do we prepare for the budget? And maybe, Dave, you want to jump in here and speak to that, but when do we start preparing for the budget?
Sure. I'll let Rob drill down into the nitty-gritty details because his area in finance is instrumental in the process. But once they've presented the draft, the directors, managers, and supervisors start the budget process very early in the year. And we meet over many months, drilling down to the general budget lines and challenging each other with the requests and projects to ensure that they're not only attainable, but they address council's strategic plan and the core service requirements of the community.
Good. I don't know if you want to add anything more, Rob, but maybe talk about our funding sources and where we get our funds from. And one of the questions that has come up this year, especially during a pandemic, are we allowed to have a deficit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Madam Mayor. And no, we are not allowed to. We're not allowed to budget for a deficit or to carry forward a deficit. I mean, at the end of the year, a deficit could occur, but we have to fund it. So really the primary funding sources for the operating budget, it's the tax levy. That would be our largest funding source. We also have the water and sewer rates, but it's important to remember that's a separate budget and it's rate supported. So if you're not on water and sewers, you're not paying those rates. When we look at the capital side, we have other funding sources, our discretionary reserves, and we also have development charges, gas tax, and other types of grants. And I guess when we look at the budget process, Dave was right. It's almost a year-long process, and a very important part in that process is the input coming from the public and the comments, because that really helps to shape the budget. And this year we had over 400 responses to our budget survey, and some of the top responses were, we want more money spent on roads, which was one of the big reasons on why we allocated our entire infrastructure levy this year to the roads repair and replacement reserve. People want to see facilities open up, and we know it's expensive to do that given the restraints of COVID-19. So we've allocated almost $800,000 to go towards that 2021.
And one of the other top items was economic development. They want to see the town moving forward with working with not only the local businesses that are here, but to bring new businesses in. Now, you mentioned our reserve, our discretionary reserves, and we made a shift a few years ago for capital to come directly from reserves. And maybe you can explain why we did that.
Yeah, the biggest reason why we did that is to stabilize the tax increase. So if you think of capital needs and capital infrastructure, they're going to vary by year. One year we may have $10 million worth of capital replacement. Another year we may have $12 million. So if we were funding that directly from the tax levy, that $2 million difference would be a 5% increase in that tax year just to do that difference, just to make up that difference. So really what we did is we're contributing to reserves every single year from our operating budget, and we're building up those reserves, and then we're drawing from those reserves to fund the capital projects. That way, if you have 10 million one year, 8 million another year, it doesn't impact the tax levy, and you get that nice stable increase.
And so some years we may draw a lot out of one reserve and maybe only put in a small amount, and that may be worrisome to some people. But if we're planning for a large expenditure, like a fire truck, for example, we don't just do that in 1 or 2 years. That takes time to build up. So I think that's a concern. So our reserves, are they at where you would want them to be, or?
No, we know we have funding gaps when it comes to our capital infrastructure, and we're not the only municipality. Every municipality across Ontario is facing these funding gaps, and really it's just identifying what they are and then creating a financial plan to address them. And that's really what we've been doing over the last few years. And our current long range financial plan recommended that we do a 1% infrastructure levy every year to try to close that funding gap. And so far we've been doing that. We did lower it to 0.5% this year, mainly because of the amount of capital projects carrying forward. But really that's the goal and how to close that funding gap.
So maybe let's get into the details of the 2021 budget. Can you give us a quick overview of the budget, the increase, and then we'll get into what some of the highlights were in a few minutes. But give us a quick overview of the budget.
Yeah, so the increase was an operating increase of 0.95%, and then there was also a capital infrastructure levy increase of 0.5%. So the total increase was 1.45%, and it's really broken down into a few areas. We had our normal inflationary pressures, our contractual increases, and that was about 0.5%. And then we had our debt servicing pressures related to the Pefferlaw Fire Hall and the link, and that was another 0.5%. And then we had our capital tax levies. So that really kind of brought forward the 1.5% increase for 2021.
Now, there's been a lot of talk both in the media and around the council table on budget day about a zero increase. Can you tell us what the impact would be of doing a zero, and maybe why that was not recommended?
Yeah, so a 0% increase really isn't sustainable. I mean, our original outlook for 2021 was going to be 3.8%, and we really did a lot of cutting and finding efficiencies to bring that down to 1.5%. We also had to delay some major projects to get it to 1.5%. The only way to get it to 0%, the only sustainable way, is to cut a service, to permanently cut a service. Because if you just temporarily cut a service, or you temporarily fund that difference from reserves, say the stabilization reserve, unless it's a one-time pressure, you're just going to have to increase the tax levy the next year to make it up, and those reserves will be depleted. And we know how important it was this year to ensure that we had reserves to deal with COVID-19.
And as I think I made the statement at budget day, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, my father always told me you can only spend it once. And that's what you mean by sustainable. We have those funds and reserves for particular reasons. Once you spend it, you have to build those reserves back up. And you'll get into a little bit detail in a few minutes here when I ask a question about the pandemic and the impact for 2021. But we did put in $1 million from one of our reserves to bring the budget to the point where it is right now. But what does this mean, the increase mean for the average taxpayer?
Yeah, so for the average taxpayer in Georgina, it'll be about a $30 increase for the year. That's for non-waterfront properties. If you're on the waterfront, it's about $54. So a little bit of a difference there, just because of the value difference usually in the houses. And it's very important to remember that when we're looking at the average assessed value, that's the current value assessment that is provided by MPAC. It's not necessarily what you can sell your house for today. And that's the big item. And when you're looking at what that average impact is, you have to look at it on your current value assessment, not necessarily what the market value of your house is today.
And I think that's what does confuse a lot of people. They look at what they sell their house for, and when we put out that the average assessment's around what is it, 462, something like that.
Yeah, it's around there, and I think the important thing to remember is when MPAC will do their next 4-year assessment, the current value assessments in Georgina are going to go up, and they're going to go up across all of Georgina. And what that's going to do is it's going to drive our tax rate down, because the town of Georgina only needs to raise the amount of money that was approved in the budget. So
Exactly.
if the assessment values go up, then that means our tax rate goes down, and the amount of taxes somebody is paying really isn't changing that much.
Exactly. It's a multiplier of the tax rate. Let's get into what are some of the highlights of this budget. You might want to mention there about the impact of the pandemic and what we did for that.
Yeah, so some of the major capital projects that we're doing $2 million in roads resurfacing and reconstruction. We are addressing safety concerns at West Park, and we're investing close to $1 million in our facilities. And as far as the impact of COVID-19 on the 2021 budget, because we're expecting the impact to be temporary, this is a reason why we funded the impact from the tax rate stabilization reserve, and it is about $1 million impact, and almost $800,000 of that relates to reopening our facilities and reopening our parks. We're finding it costs really more money to be able to open these facilities than to keep them closed, because of the additional measures that we have to have in place to address COVID-19, as well as the reduced capacities that we have to implement.
Exactly. When we said earlier on at the EOC that closing was easy, you shut the doors and you close up. Reopening brings its own set of issues. Now, you've mentioned the rate stabilization reserve a couple times here. Maybe tell what that is, where we get the funds, and what the level should be, and where we are right now with that.
Yeah, so the tax rate stabilization reserve is really intended to assist in stabilizing the tax increase year over year, and that may be setting funds aside for an expenditure that may occur in the future, so you build up to that expenditure, or it may be to fund what we've run into this year, an impact that we didn't know was going to happen. So our reserve was sitting around $1.4 million prior to 2021. However, we do have to draw $1 million from that reserve to address COVID-19, and without that reserve in place and without that balance, we really would have been looking at close to a 4% increase this year, because we wouldn't have had anywhere to fund those temporary expenditures.
And that's something we had set up a couple of years ago, the rate stabilization reserve, and drawing the funds to build that up. And where do we get the funds from?
Yeah, so the funds come from the operating budget, and mainly through our surplus deficit.
Perfect. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap things up for the budget. That was great information, Rob. I know we could talk all day about budgets, but if residents want more details, they can visit our town website. We're going to take a quick break, but come back when we'll talk more with Dave Redden, Georgina's CAO. Welcome back. I'm Mayor Margaret Quirk, and this is Service Georgina on Rogers TV. Joining me today now is Dave Redden, Georgina's Chief Administrative Officer, and we have Rob Weeder as our Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer. We talked earlier about the budget. Now we're going to talk to Mr. Redden about business continuity and how we dealt with that during the pandemic. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Dave. You're the longest serving member or full-time member of staff with Georgina. How long have you been with the town? And maybe a Reader's Digest version of the positions you've held.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, I've been with the town for quite a while, and I started back in 1981. So I'm embarking upon my 40 years of service very soon.
Congratulations and thank you.
So I will give you a Reader's Digest version of the positions I've held, because it's a long list, and I know we've got time limits here. But when I started in 81, I began in a permanent part-time position in the purchasing division as a building attendant security guard. Around that time, I also held positions in the parks division, doing sidewalk plowing, and I also was responsible to plow the Civic Center parking lots and walkways before the building opened to the public each day when we had snow. Around 1983, I moved to a full-time position in the then Treasury Department within the Tax and Water Division. I pretty much held all of the positions in that division over a number of years before I moved to the supervisor role in 89. And then I moved to the manager of tax and revenue in 1997. And in 2016, centralized corporate customer service was also transferred under that portfolio with me. But in 2017, I did move to the Director of Corporate Services and Deputy CAO role. And for most of 2018, I was the acting Chief Administrative Officer. And in May 2019, I was selected permanently for the position.
Well, you've certainly held a variety of positions, which I think really gives you a real good feeling for, all the various departments and a good overview. So what's your role as CAO? What does a CAO do in a municipal structure?
So the role of a CAO is to be the administrative lead of the organization. And a key is being the link between council and all of our staff, which is critical to the success of any municipality. As the CAO, I am actually the sole employee of council. All of our other staff report to supervisors, managers, and directors. The senior management team, which is comprised of directors, do report directly to me. My role is also to ensure council's strategic plan and directions are implemented, as well to ensure that our essential services are delivered to the public based on council's direction to me. I, together with the senior management team, provide professional advice to assist council in decisions and delivering their goals. I would add the role of the CAO is ever changing, and it's far-reaching across the organization. And my day-to-day work has been interesting over this last year with COVID-19. But
that's one way to call it interesting. It's certainly been a very long year. When it came to the pandemic starting in March, one of the issues that came forward was business continuity. And can you tell everyone what that means and how did we prepare for that business continuity during a pandemic?
Sure. The basic principle of business continuity is to have a strategy on how the organization would continue to operate efficiently and deliver our high priority services during an emergency event or a disruption that would require that we implement and start the requirements of our emergency plan. We were very fortunate to be prepared because in 2019 we went through many exercises to update our current business continuity planning, which identified our top 5 priorities, which were fire suppression, crisis communication, water and wastewater, winter road maintenance, and of course our payroll services. Through the pandemic, it was very obvious that information technology, our communications division, and our human resources division were paramount to our business continuity plans.
So from a day-to-day operations, how did we deal with the pandemic? I know there's a management team, but how did we deal with making sure that the everyday things that residents expect still happened? And were there projects that had to be delayed, and what will happen to those projects?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we were prepared because we did have a business continuity plan established. However, most disruptions or emergency events, whether it's an ice storm, where there's impacts for a couple days. What we weren't prepared for, but I think we've done a good job is the length of time that's been involved with the pandemic. But doing that exercise in 2019, it put us in a better place. As far as projects there are a number of projects that have been delayed throughout 2020 that are important, but were not deemed a priority under the pandemic in order to manage to still deliver our services. The projects that were delayed will be brought forward with staff's professional advice and eventually completed or returned to the council table for further discussion.
Now, what were some of the major changes or adjustments that we had to put in place? Certainly what we're doing right now in terms of having a Zoom format, but what were some of the other changes that did take place and adjustments we had to make?
Definitely moving to a virtual environment and platforms like Zoom or Teams had to be done very quickly in order to keep business running. We had to deploy a large amount of technology to many staff in a short period of time, and to accommodate about 40% reduction in the staff that were located within the Civic Center in order to protect staff and provide for that physical distancing. As well, we had to really focus and expedite a number of services that traditionally are done with paper or in person to an online platform. So those technology was huge. Our IT department did a great job at securing and deploying a number of tablets and laptops so that we could accommodate work from home programs.
And maybe, Mr. Reeder, you can speak to some of the technologies that had to be adjusted. Your department oversees the IT area. What were the challenges, and what did we have to ensure during this time?
Yeah, so as Dave mentioned earlier, there's certain key priorities with our business continuity plan, and IT is really connected to all of those priorities. So whether it's water and wastewater with the SCADA system for monitoring it, whether it's payroll services to ensure that they continue, whether it's accounts payable to ensure that we can continue to pay our contractors. We have procurement services. Another large one is customer service. So corporate communications is obviously very important to get the information out there. And then we also have customer service where, residents are calling into the town. And because our Civic Center was closed to physically come in, we had to make sure that, we were always available to address any concerns and come up with ways to address them in a way that residents are happy with as well. So I think we've done a great job over the last 9 months. A lot of change has happened internally with the processes we've been doing, and we're going to have to continue that change leading into next year.
And some of those changes we had sort of planned, but it was in a work plan that was not the condensed version that we've had to do. So we are looking at rolling out some other changes for some of those areas that still are paper based. So it certainly did push the time frame up. We may get back into that in a minute, but I want to cover one of the phrases that you've used a lot over the last few months, Mr. Redden, is it isn't business as usual, it's business as unusual. What do you see for business as usual? What do you see happening? In terms of when we will get out of the pandemic, what's the new model going to be, or do we know?
Well, that's actually a difficult question, Madam Mayor, but as I still think we have many hurdles that we're going to have to manage over the coming months. I don't think that we'll be able to return to what we would call business as usual until probably late into 2021. As vaccines become available for COVID, I think we really need to help and focus on managing expectations, as things are not going to change tomorrow.
No.
I wouldn't want to send any false hope that vaccines are here and mid-January we're back to the way things are, because that just isn't going to happen based on the population of this country and the logistics involved in the inoculation process. So I still think it will be some time before we return to normal, but I'm hopeful that at some point in 2021 it'll look much brighter. I do think that going forward, the work from home model will form part of our regular way we do business. I think I said this before that when it comes to work from home, municipalities have been somewhat of a dinosaur when engaging that. We do have still a number of staff working from home, and some of them actually produce more working from home because they don't have the day-to-day interruptions that are within an office environment. But definitely that model, or a hybrid model,
really don't know. I know, I think other municipalities, the region is looking at not looking at having staff come back into the Civic Center or their municipal offices until, September of next year. I think Vaughan just made that announcement recently as well. And that asks a question. We did mention departments that have risen to the top in terms of being extremely important. We've mentioned IT, and we've mentioned just briefly our human resources and communications. If you can just tell me a little bit more about what the human resources department has done in terms of being an integral part of the closures and of the reopenings.
Sure. Definitely human resources. It was paramount because we, when we first went into lockdown in the first phase, we were required to lay off some staff, and we were also required to redeploy some staff. So without their coordination and expertise, it could have really hurt our day-to-day activities, but no, they were instrumental.
Exactly. And we've said closing was one thing. Reopening has caused a number of new issues. Yeah. Well, I think we're just about out of time, gentlemen. And as I said, I could probably sit with the two of you for a couple hours and go over what we've gone through in the last 10 months. But I thank you for all the information that you provided today. Thank you for joining me. I'm Mayor Margaret Quirk, and this has been Service Georgina on Rogers TV. See you next time.